the main idea of this talk is to try and point out where there are deficiencies in religion and why the world has rejected religion. And as a result of their rejection of religion, they've taken on certain alternative lifestyles. And what I want to show is what the problem is with these alternative lifestyles or alternative beliefs. And I want to show that in actuality, all of these beliefs are actually found in the Torah. And so that's the purpose of this talk. And I'm not degrading what these five ways of life are. I wouldn't call them exactly a way of life, but 5 beliefs are. I want to say at the end that everything actually is found in the Torah, and that one does not need to go outside of the Torah. But I was very impressed, and I've mentioned this already a few times, that there was a research done by the Pew Research Center. I believe it was done in July of 2019, where they asked questions of different people all over the world. And the initial question was, do you believe that you could be a moral person without God, without religion? This was asked in many, many countries all over the world. And if you go to this Pew Research and look it up, they actually have maps of the whole world, and they give you a percentage of the belief of a particular place. And what was kind of shocking is that the places that scored highest were Brazil and the Philippines. Brazil scored 84% and the Philippines 96%, which means that 84% or 96% of the population believes that belief in God, belief in a religion is necessary in order to teach a person right from wrong. India scored high, 79%, and the lowest score went to Sweden. Sweden only had 9%. So it sounds like Sweden is a country where people are not big believers. And they believed apparently that they assumed that a person can come up with right and wrong without religion and without God. The average, United States and Israel was almost the same. Israel at 48% and the United States 44%, which means 52% of the population in Israel do not believe that belief in God or belief in religion, or the Torah for that matter, is necessary in order for a person to have religion. And Canada scored pretty low as well, but it sounds like the Canadians aren't such great believers. They only scored 26%. So what I noticed too is the ones that scored low is France 15%, Spain 22%, Sweden 9%, Canada 26%. Russia has improved. Of all the countries, that many countries, it's a drop when they did a similar test in 1991 to today. Most of the countries have less faith, less belief in God, but Russia, surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, went up. And yeah, I'll leave some time for questions at the end. And okay, so everyone should not interrupt. All right, the other things that they found is that the richer the country, the less people believed. That was one interesting point, and I found that interesting because I know that in the Shema, where it says "V'ayim shamoah," that you better listen to the Torah, and if you don't listen, bad things are going to happen to you. It says, "Ein adam mored be'akadosh baruch hu ela mitoch tzvi'ah," that a person only rebels against God when he's filled up and when he has plenty. And so that explains this this research that that people are less believers when they're comfortable, when they have money, when they have things, they don't really need God. What they also found is that older people believe in God more than the younger generation, and people whose political policies are more right-wing people are more believers than left-wing people. And the higher a person's education, the less a person believed. So all this stuff is kind of disturbing, but I thought that this has been bothering me for a long time, and I trying to understand why. And I think that in many instances, people believe that religion has failed, and that religion is not delivering the good, so to speak, and that and because of that, they don't believe that you need religion. So if you just look at some of the religions, they don't have necessarily such a great track record when people use religion for their own personal gains, and people use religion for domination, and people use religion as a justification for wars. You think about Christianity and the Crusades, how many people died at their hands. You think about Islam and suicide bombers, people that are Allah Akbar, that are dying in the name of religion. So it's understandable why people won't turn to religion. And on Judaism, we must admit that a lot of the way that Judaism is presented, or maybe there's a misconception about that, is that people find it to be too extreme, or not open-minded enough for people to be able to relate to it. Especially in recent years, the religious community has become very extreme. People are more Haredi, more extreme, more ultra-Orthodox, more into all these stringencies. And people think that you don't need religion in order to be happy. And I think that Judaism is also somewhat guilty of that. On the one hand, we boast about how many Baalei Tshuva we have, and probably because of the state of Israel, there's a number of people who have returned to Judaism. And it also explains why there are a number of converts that are returning to Judaism, because they realize something's going on here, that they could sort of see an inexplicable advance of this little country, and it must be that God is watching over them. But people who aren't as deep or searching don't necessarily see religion as something which is necessary, and they believe that it crimps their style. So what do people believe in if they don't believe in religion? So I narrowed it down to 5 areas of belief that exist in today's world. Belief number 1 is how important it is to do whatever makes you happy. If something makes you happy, then it's something that you should do, regardless of what the boundaries might be. So I'm going to tell you what the 5 categories are, and I'll tell you that this is the way that these are the things that people believe nowadays. So one of them is, rather than be religious, rather than believe in God and look at God for morality, they will believe that it's most important to do what makes you happy. The second belief, and I'm going to discuss each one of them, is democracy. And that democracy becomes such an important belief in people that it often outshines anything else, that you're not allowed to do anything or profess to have a belief that challenges democracy. The third category is the belief in fighting racism, that the worst thing that a person can be is a racist. The fourth is the importance of tolerance and love, and just loving everybody and just trying to be understanding of every person. And if you're able to do that, then you're able to make the world a better place, and this becomes an important belief. And the fifth item on my list is the belief in global warming, that your reason for your existence is to save the planet. And if you save the planet, then you save the world. And so these are things that people believe. So let's go over each one of them. And after I go over each one of them, I am going to say that all these beliefs are not bad. But if they are beliefs without God and without the Torah, then they lead to emptiness, futility, depression, sadness. But if these beliefs are incorporated within the Torah, then everything is wonderful, because the Torah believes in these things too, maybe not to the extent of the way that others do, but I'm going to show you that these 5 beliefs are contained within the Torah and within Judaism. So about the first one, I want to be happy, and all I want is for myself to be happy, and I want to see other people being happy. And this becomes the creed. And so that when parents raise their child, they will say, I want them to do whatever makes them happy. And nowadays, even if people are doing things that are questionable or possibly even deviant, I've heard people say, I want my child to be happy. And if when they become a teenager, they decide that they were given the wrong sex and they want to do a sex change, and that's what's going to make them happy, then I want them to do it, because being happy is everything. Whatever makes you happy is what a person should be able to do. And because of this belief, there is a justification in many ways for questionable behavior, behavior that is borderline of where do you draw the line, and in which case the happiness becomes the ultimate goal, and that's why often bad behavior is accepted, and often you have families where people are doing things that are in a wrong way, and people don't say anything. Like, for example, I remember there was a relative who, older fellow who thought he'd never get married, and he was decided he would go for a mail order bride. And and because it was a family where everyone wants everyone else to be happy, nobody would say anything to the guy saying, "Are you out of your mind? What are you doing?" You know. And then he found some girl. I don't remember where it was. And the girl already said, "I love you, I love you, I love you," and she was probably in her 20s, and he was in his 60s, and they're in love. You know, and nobody would say anything. Luckily, he eventually came to his senses. But look, if it makes him happy, then everything is okay. Whatever you want to do, if it makes you happy. So that becomes a philosophy, and it becomes a way of life, and it's happy, 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 and whatever makes anyone happy, that's the thing that a person should be able to do. And of course, things that make people happy don't necessarily last, and then people are always looking for something else that makes them happy, and they think they're going to find it, and they usually don't. So that's the idea. First philosophy that you hear from people all the time is, I want to do what makes person happy. I want to do what makes him happy. And that's why parents maybe don't discipline their children, because the child is saying, I'm just trying to do something that makes me happy. And that's how there comes a justification for that belief. So that's belief number one. I want to be happy. What about democracy? So democracy has become a kind of a idol worship to some degree, because Western countries believe that democracy is going to solve everything. And as long as a country is democratic, then everything is going to be fine. I may have mentioned this, I don't mean to plug myself, but I once wrote an article titled "The Problem with Democracy." And if you just Google those words, "the problem with democracy," you'll get an article that I wrote talking about what the limitations are. I'll get to that in a few minutes. But when you understand that there's certain things that you cannot say. If you say to somebody that I'm against democracy, that you immediately have gained an enemy. And because of the belief in democracy, this is why we see the insanity of what we've witnessed over the last 9 months or so since COVID began, is that you cannot stop anybody from demonstrating. Because if you don't allow a demonstration, then you're not allowing a person free speech, and you're not allowing him democracy. And that takes precedence over everything else, even though these could be super spreaders, and it could be that it's dangerous. But because democracy is the most important thing, democracy is the ultimate. That's something that you can't dare take away from somebody the right of free speech in any way, in order to prevent a person from being able to express himself. So if you're not democratic, then there's something seriously wrong with you, or if you even insinuate that there might be something wrong with democracy. Now, it's kind of interesting that today, when we talk about democracy, and not everyone is actually as democratic as they think they are, because a lot of what we're seeing in the world today with democratic beliefs is supposed to be free speech. It's supposed to be a situation where you're able to express your view and not have a problem. But today, people are democratic until you disagree with them, which is a different problem. But let's get to number three. Number three, racism. So what we're talking about is, why is it that people believe, and so many people in the world do believe, that you don't need God, you don't need religion in order to learn morality? So I'm saying, if they've rejected religion, they've chosen alternative beliefs. So one of them is the belief in being happy. The second is democracy, that I believe in democracy is the second belief. And the third belief is racism, is that the worst thing that a person could be is a racist. If you're a racist, your behavior is absolutely inexcusable. And racism becomes the number one negative trait that a person can have that makes him a kind of a villain and despised by all. And that's why you saw a situation where people are able to rob and loot, and that's okay because they're protesting racism. So of course you loot because someone is a racist, and racism becomes the justification. And as I was preparing this lecture, suddenly occurred to me that I remember that I was fortunate to know personally Rabbi Meir, who was a very controversial figure, but I had him as my Shabbos guest a few times when I lived in Los Angeles. And he ran for the Knesset of Israel and won, and he was banned from the Knesset because of one thing. He was labeled a racist. So people couldn't understand why was it that Rav Kahana was banned from the Knesset, and members of the Knesset who openly spoke about the destruction of Israel were allowed to remain in the Knesset, and they weren't banned because they were allowed democracy overruled racism because they were just expressing their opinion, but they were still not labeled as racist. Once you get the label as a racist, then your opinion is absolutely unacceptable, and that's exactly what they did to Donald Trump. I had an incident recently with a student who was doing illustrations. He's an artist, and he was paid to do illustrations of the Haggadah. So I said to him, "Oh, you're an artist. How are you going to portray the wicked son in the Haggadah?" In my day, well, they would portray the wicked son. We had a Haggadah in the family where you see a guy smoking a cigar, and reading the horse racing results, and that was considered a wicked son. Today, he said, well, he'd probably have to be like a Ku Klux Klansman. That's how he would portray the wicked son, because the most wicked you could be is racist. If you're a racist, it's absolutely inexcusable behavior. Other bad behaviors are excusable, but not racism. And there are many people in this world who believe that as long as you fight racism, then you're going to make the world a better place, because racism is something which isn't tolerated, whereas their own views are absolutely intolerant to anybody who expresses something a little different to them. But they believe that they're doing something really good. So that's where racism comes in as a third belief. A fourth belief that I talk about is tolerance. I might call it pseudo-tolerance, is the importance of giving love to everybody, and that you have to love everyone, and you have to understand everybody, and you have to understand that everyone has their beliefs, and basically the people who are the ones giving all this love and tolerance have a belief that truth is relative. Okay, this is a very this statement, truth is relative, is very, very much against the Torah, because the Torah believes there is only one truth, and that is God and the Torah. But the danger of the belief that truth is relative means that in the end, you never identify anybody as evil. And that's a dangerous view to have, in that you do not identify evil, because then you just say, well, he's frustrated, and he's only rioting because of his frustration, or he's only stealing because of his frustration, and he's only bombing people because he's frustrated, because he's poor. And if he would just get more love, if we would just love him and give him love and affection, then he wouldn't act that way, because everybody is inherently good, and they're just acting out their frustration of not being loved, so that if you just love everybody, then everything is going to be fine. And I know, you could probably look it up too. There are people watching this who are very quick on the computer. I don't know the name of the woman, but I did hear about a woman from India who a few years ago, she's probably still around, she's traveling around the world giving hugs. A little short lady, and people wait in line for hours to get a hug from this woman. And they say she's remarkable, and people feel wonderful about getting hugs. So I know people who have this belief of tolerance and acceptance of everybody. And when I'll read something horrible, that someone's done a horrible crime, I'll say to them, well, I guess that guy didn't get enough hugs, and that's why he committed the crime that he committed. I think there were two young ladies who decided they were going to go somewhere in a very, very rough area, and they're going to just give love and hugs to everybody. And I think they were roughed up pretty bad, probably raped, probably beat up, if not murdered. So, but anyways, people do believe that you got to give love and you got to give understanding and you have to give tolerance, and everybody has their thing, and it's all about love and warmth, etc. So that is a fourth belief. The fifth belief is save the planet, right? Because a lot of times people who have no connection to religion at all, they would fall into the category of what I mentioned earlier in this Pew report, Pew research on how most of the Western world, more than half on the average, do not believe that you need God for morality. So they have to believe in something. So they might want to believe in all these things. They want to believe that you have to let people be happy, do whatever makes you happy. You have to believe in democracy. You have to be anti-racist. You have to be tolerant. But then the big thing is you have to save the planet. So you're doing some noble cause, and you have to believe in fighting global warming, because who knows? You know, one of these politicians said in 10 years the world is going to blow up or something like that. And this becomes the ultimate. And there are people today in America that are talking about investing trillions of dollars to save the planet because of all the terrible things that are going on in the world. And so global warming is the biggest detriment to what's going on in the world. Okay, now those are the beliefs. I'll repeat them. People believe you got to do whatever makes you happy. These are the alternative beliefs because they don't want to believe in God and they don't want to believe in the Torah. They want to believe in democracy at all costs. They want to be anti-racist. They want to be tolerant and full of love, and they want to fight global warming. Now, what does Judaism have to say about this? I'm going to now prove in the time that I have remaining that none of these beliefs are bad. They're just weak when they are not part of the Torah. So we have to believe that everything is in the Torah, and the beliefs that I mentioned by themselves are only going to lead to futility and sadness. And we must start with the premise that Judaism is perfect. Those who practice it are not. Very important quote I heard from my friend Rabbi Aaron Rakefet. He quoted somebody else. And we have to know we can't blame Judaism on religious Judaism or Judaism at all on the basis of those who do not represent it in a good way. We have to know that the religion is perfect and the Torah is perfect. I often like to quote the Rambam, who describes how the Torah was written. When the Rambam talks about how the Torah was written, he said it wasn't a situation where God is dictating and Moshe is the secretary. This is the greatest person who ever lived. He's on Mount Sinai. He's not eating. He's not drinking. He's in the highest state of prophetic state that any man has ever achieved. And this actually doesn't get as much recognition among all the great things that are mentioned in the Torah. How about the fact that Moshe went to Mount Sinai 2 or 3 times, depending on the opinion that you're following, and he didn't eat and he didn't drink for 40 days. That's pretty miraculous. Most human beings couldn't live for 40 days. And he's getting the Torah, and God is dictating it to him. But how is God dictating it to him? He's dictating it through telepathic messaging, through prophecy. And what is he dictating? A book written by God himself. Now, a book written by God himself, as recorded by the greatest man who ever lived, has to be a book that is absolute perfection. It cannot be a book that many of these believers and these other beliefs believe is no longer applicable to today. It's out of date, which is a horribly heretic thing to say, but we have to believe that such a book is perfection. And if we're seeing people who are not practicing the religion in the way that they should, it's just because perhaps maybe their chinuch isn't exactly right, their education isn't exactly right, but they're missing out on the truth of Judaism. Now, when we talk about Judaism, we have to talk about a basic premise of Judaism. A basic premise of Judaism is that there is good in the world and there is evil in the world. And when we daven every day, and we say after Yishtabach, Yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei et hakol, right? When we talk about that pasuk, What's really the pasuk that God creates light and God creates darkness? It's a variation of a verse that's in the book of Isaiah. And in the book of Isaiah, it says, Yotzer Or, Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, Yotzer Or Uvorei Choshech, God creates light and God creates dark. Oseh Shalom Uvorei Ra, He makes peace and He created evil. Ani Hashem Oseh Kol Ela, I am God, the one who created, the one who did all of these things. So what do we learn from that? And there's another pasuk in Kohelet that says, Kohelet 7:14, that says, Et zeh leumat zeh asa Elokim. This opposite this, Hashem created. In other words, Hashem created two different extremes in the world, and there is good and there is evil, and it is extremely important to understand that this is an imperfect world and that we have to make the right choice. If we choose good over evil, we get tremendous reward. If we choose evil over good, God forbid, then we end up suffering. There is another very important quote from Rabbi Eli Monk in Kol HaTorah, his commentary on the Torah reading, where he says, only God is capable of teaching what good and evil is. So what we must start with is the premise that there is good in the world and there is definitely evil in the world. Man can choose to be good, man can choose to be evil. It is up to him. And this is the key point. It really isn't possible for man to be able to make up rules of what is good and what is evil. Now, I'm not sure exactly the age of all the people that are listening, but for somebody like me, who was born in the 50s, I would say that we've seen a huge decline in morality in the world. Things that were never tolerated, as just in my lifetime, are tolerated more and more and more. And when we have students in Machon Meir and I interview them, I will ask a very pointed question to somebody who's reached the age of 18 or 20 or 25. I said, okay, which of the following four things have you been connected with or possibly even addicted with? And it's pretty sad that I have to ask this question. Sex, drugs, pornography, or alcohol? Because this is the way people grow up today. It wasn't always that way. And this is in a world when everyone's believing in the love and anti-racism and democracy and everything else. But yet we see a terrible, terrible decline. I can remember when we first heard about couples that were living together, not married. And that was considered like a tremendously horrible thing that people could do something like that, because you're supposed to wait until you get married. And halachically, if two non-Jews are living together in the same home, they're considered married. And so therefore, if a guy is with the girlfriend or slash wife of this person, that's considered adultery for non-Jews. So we have to admit that we've seen a huge decline in, and it's not, some people see it as progress, but because of the lack of belief in God, because man believes that he's capable of making rules, we see this horrible decline. And people decide that they can decide what is right and wrong. And we know from the Torah that a person is guided by his Yetzer Hara, he's guided by his evil inclination. And we say, Yetzer Lev Hadam Rak Ra Minu Rav, person's evil inclination, it's evil from him, and he will make excuses. He will be guided by his own drives and his own lusts, and he will decide what is right and wrong in his own eyes. Just as it says in the prophets, by Amim Hahem, there were certain times where it said, by Amim Hahem, in those days, Ein Melech b'Yisrael, there was no king in Israel. Ish hayashar be'einav yaseh, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And that's what happens when society or people decide what is good and what is bad. Some say there is no such thing as bad. And that's why we have a terrible decline. I know that we looked at this pasuk recently, another pasuk in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, where it says, Hoi haomrim lara tov. Woe is the generation that calls evil good, velatov ra, and good evil. Samim choshech leor. They make darkness into light, ve'or lechoshech, and light into darkness. Samim mar lematok, umatok lemar. They make the bitter sweet and the sweet bitter. Doesn't that sound like our generation? And so that's what we're living in. And because people don't accept God and religion, these become a religion in itself. The racism becomes a religion. The hatred for racism becomes a religion. And society is very messed up because there isn't a clear definition of good and evil, because it's a man-made definition. And man, when he makes up his definition of good and evil, he inevitably will self-destruct. So we need Torah in order to learn what is good and evil. We also learn from the Torah that there are two poles in the world. There's a pole pulling you to good, and there's a pole turning you to evil. What do we say on Friday night in our prayers? We say, Ohave Hashem sin ura. Those who love God hate evil. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to love good. We're supposed to hate evil. Those who truly love God. And the Netivot Shalom had an interesting point about this, where he says, Kol od ein la Yehudi sin alara, as long as a person does not have hatred for evil, uliosei hara, and those who do evil, haresh yesh lo adayin shayachut lara. He's still connected to the evil. And what a person has to do is he has to be mima'es lara, in the words of the Netivot Shalom. He has to find evil, something which is despicable. And this is the way that a person, otherwise you get attached to it. And you have to know that there's a pole. There's a pole of good, there's a pole of evil. There's a pole of purity, there's a pole of impurity. That's the whole idea of Chanukah, that we're celebrating the victory of the pure over the impure, the holiness over the profane. And that's what we have to start with. So the starting point is the belief that only God can decide what is truly good and what is truly evil. And the recognition that there are poles, that if we're not pulled to good, that we're pulled to evil. And a person has to make his decision. We say at the end of Kohelet, Sof davar hakol nishma, when all is said and done, et halokim yarav et mitzvotav tishmor. Fear God and keep the commandments, because that is all that there is to man. And that is something that a person needs to recognize. A person has to work on his connection to God and his fear of God, because that's where he will find strength, and that's where he will find a certain direction in life. Now, how can we incorporate these 5 beliefs into Judaism? I said earlier that it is possible to believe that in all these things are not necessarily bad, but I want to be able to explain these 5 beliefs within the context of Judaism. So let's talk about happiness. Well, first of all, the Torah is all in favor of happiness. There's such a thing as simcha shel mitzvah. The joy of doing a mitzvah brings a person happiness. What do we say? Mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha. It is a great mitzvah to be in a state of joy. So we are supposed to be happy. The holidays are v'samachta b'chagecha. You have an obligation to be happy at a holiday. And then we say, ein simcha lebasar v'yayin. Meat and wine makes a man happy. So there's constant emphasis on the importance of being happy. There's also an emphasis on love. When we talk about falling in love, the Torah is absolutely in favor of falling in love. The Rambam says that a person should be passionate in his love for his wife. And he's supposed to have a relationship of absolute love and absolute trust with his wife, maybe 1 or 2 other people, maybe with his rabbi, but trusting and loving is important, because if you don't have that relationship with a human being, you will not be able to have that relationship of trust and love with God. So that's why it is important to love. Being loved and loving someone else brings a person happiness. So you are supposed to be happy. But the real happiness comes not when we just do whatever makes us feel good at the moment, whatever makes you happy. The real happiness comes when we're disciplined, when we wait and we know that we're following a system of rules, and when we know there's a time and a place for everything. And when we are able to have the restraint to be principled and moral people and not give in to temptation or not give in to things that might be ways for us to be doing something which is unethical or improper. And when we have that strength to do what's right, there's a great deal of happiness. But that's real happiness. That's not the happiness of getting your quick fix to find joy. This is a much deeper happiness that comes with hard work. So is the Torah for happiness? Does the Torah want you to be happy? Absolutely. But the Torah wants you to be happy in a way that the happiness comes from a much deeper place, or a place where a person is really and truly working on himself. And that's when you achieve a real kind of happiness. So it's a very different thing than just doing whatever makes you feel good for the moment, because there are rules, there are guidelines. And when you're living within that guideline and you know that what you're doing is what God tells you to do, then you have a great deal of satisfaction. Now, what about democracy? What does the Torah really say about democracy? Is the Torah against democracy? Not at all. However, the problem is that if you totally believe in majority rule, then the majority could rule that people are allowed to live together, or majority could rule that you could have same-sex marriages. Majority could legalize drugs and dangerous drugs because the majority rules. So that's the part where, on the one hand, we have Jewish courts that are all odd-numbered courts. We have a court of 3, a court of 23, a court of 71, so that they vote, and that's democratic. And in many situations, it says that Gemara talks about, uses the word nimnu. Nimnu means they voted, and things do go according to majority rule. And so there is such a thing as the majority deciding, and it's democratic. But when it crosses the line of what God, in giving us a system of rules of what is right and what is proper, when it crosses that line, that's where democracy ends. It's interesting that the state of Israel is in a situation where we have what somebody called a schizophrenic Bill of Rights or Declaration of Independence, I think, where it says it's a Jewish state where all religions are welcome. So, and it's democratic, a democratic Jewish state where all religions are welcome. So that's a problem, because how could you be a Jewish state and be a democratic state? If that's the case, then another people, if they become the majority, they could decide that we're no longer a Jewish state. So we're in favor of democracy to a point, but at a certain point where it crosses the line of morality and right and wrong and being able to live according to the Torah, then democracy is no longer applicable. And when we talk about racism, what does the Torah have to say about racism? Is the Torah against racism? Again, Torah for sure is against racism. How do we know the Torah is not racist? Because of conversion. Anybody, regardless of his race, his color, wherever he comes from, whatever color he is, whatever shape, whatever size, if he sincerely wants to join the Jewish people, he is welcome. We just want to make sure that that person is sincere. As long as he's sincere, we accept him as part of the Jewish people. That makes us not racist. It makes us very tolerant. You know, I mentioned the Ku Klux Klan earlier. Could a black Jew join the Ku Klux Klan? They are racist. We are not. Now, in terms of how we live, in terms of us against the nations, we have a different set of rules. We live according to the Torah of 613 commandments. The nations of the world are supposed to live according to 7 laws. And once we had guest speakers in Machon Meir, we had a couple who were Noachites. And there were a couple in their 50s, and they said, we follow the 7 Noachide laws, and our job is to be righteous. Your job is to be holy. The 613 mitzvot allow a Jew to attain holiness. The 7 mitzvot, the 7 commandments that of the Noachides or of all non-Jews, allow them to become righteous people. And righteous people, we call Chasidei Umot HaOlam, are also given a share in the world to come. So we are not racist. We have our own lifestyle, they have their lifestyle. We are definitely not supposed to sit around and talk about hating anybody. Now, certain people, certain nations that want to destroy us are difficult to love, but it's not beneficial to talk about hating them because of what they want to do. We have to do what we have to do to protect ourselves, but we definitely don't speak about, that we hate them because of the race. We don't necessarily hate them, but we have a difficulty with them when they want to destroy us, so we have to act accordingly. So that's how I've answered the question of democracy. I've answered the question about wanting to be happy. I've answered the question about racism. Now, what about tolerance and love? Well, the Torah does have a commandment that we are supposed to love every Jew. There's also a commandment that we're not allowed to hate another Jew. Lo tisnad achicha bilvavecha. You're not allowed to hate another Jew in your heart. And that you have to learn there's a mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael. So we are in favor of love, and we are in favor of sometimes being forgiving. Somebody asks you 3 times to forgive you, then you allow yourself, you forgive the person. You don't stand on holding a grudge, because we are a very tolerant people, and so that's something which is also a part of the Torah. But to tolerate evil, we will not tolerate evil. To tolerate bad behavior, we will not tolerate bad behavior. We learned in Mishlei recently, spare the rod, spoil the child. That what kind of parent doesn't discipline their children and teach them and give them a clear definition of what is right and wrong, and not just say it, but lead by example. That you have to do. That doesn't make you intolerant because you're in favor of standing up for what's right and wrong. You are tolerant of people, and you're tolerant of people's shortcomings. You're tolerant of people's own weaknesses, but you're not to tolerate bad behavior. You're not to tolerate evil. That's a big difference. But in general, yes, we are in favor of tolerance as well. And what about global warming? What is our opinion of global warming? Is there anything in the Torah that talks about global warming? So I would say that probably the mitzvah of not cutting down a fruit tree would fall under the category of global warming, because from the case of not cutting down a fruit tree, we have a principle called bal tashchit, that we're not supposed to be wasteful. That's why you don't have Jewish religious kids having food fights. They're learned from a young age that you don't waste food, and we don't waste and we don't destroy. So we're not allowed to destroy our planet. We're not allowed to destroy our waterways and polluting our seas, polluting our rivers. These would all fall under the category of bal tashchit, and that we do have to think about what's good for other people, because there are many, many laws that do talk about tolerance. I mean, what about all the laws that deal with the laws of shchenim? There's a whole section in halacha called Hilchot Shchenim, the laws of neighbors. There's certain things you can't do because it's disturbing to a neighbor. You can't open a tannery near someone's house because of the bad odor. You have to be tolerant. You can't have, let's say, a restaurant where smoke of smelly food is coming, because there's tolerance. But we have to be cognizant of what's going on around us and not doing things that are going to be harmful to others. And so I think that the bal tashchit is the source, how we have to be careful not to do things that are going to be destroying society, destroying our planet. So I think that global warming is also under the umbrella of Judaism. So all these beliefs that people think they're so smart that they don't need Judaism, and these are the things that are going to bring them joy, they're actually contained within Judaism. But when you're doing it within the boundaries of the Torah, of what God commands us to do, that we're supposed to act in a certain way, then what we're doing isn't just our beliefs. What we're doing is an act of a mitzvah. And there's joy that comes with a mitzvah. There's satisfaction that comes with the mitzvah. And then we know that we're living a life that God is watching us and God is proud of us for the way that we're living. So I thought that it was important to mention that the people who think that the answers are not in the Torah are actually wrong, because everything is within the Torah. People have to live according to the Torah in a beautiful way, and they have to teach the Torah in a beautiful way, and let them know that you don't have to look elsewhere to find meaning. The Torah is not against any of these things, but these points that I raised have to be observed within the boundaries of the Torah. And when one lives according to the Torah, that's when we really have a beautiful world. And the beautiful world is such because everybody knows what good is, everybody knows what evil is, and people learn how to treat each other properly. And then the world becomes what we pray for every day. We just in the davening in Aleinu, Bayom Hahu, Yihiyeh Hashem Echad, Ushmo Echad. On that day, Hashem will be one, and His name will be one, because they're all united, Jew and non-Jew alike, each one living according to the lifestyle that he needs to, with allowing God to guide us. And that's what really brings us real satisfaction and meaning. That is what I have to say. If there's anybody who would like to ask a few questions, I'm happy to answer them. And yes, sir. Achihud.
I got two. So you had mentioned the government, this like a schizophrenic constitution or whatever. Well, in general, it seems that right now, just in the time frame that we're in, especially the past 20 years, that governments globally have been causing more problems than what they're solving. Like they're projecting certain things that aren't necessarily true. Like, in America, we're told that, the Russians are out to get us. But, I come to Machon, Meir, and some of the Russians are some of my best friends, and they're the ones that befriended me. So why are these governments worldwide, why are they causing so many problems, and how are we going to solve this problem and keep them from tearing the world apart?
Well, the main problem right there is that they're not believers in God. They're believers in their own way of life. And apparently what you're describing are people who are interested in their own personal gains, and they distort. And that's why, because they don't have God, that's a perfect example of where they're really harming the world, and they're harming people. And we're getting closer to messianic times because of all the things that have taken place in Israel. And I think that the impurities are really raising their ugly heads right now, and we're seeing it. So at least people who are believers are seeing that there's so much lies going on all the time, and people who are supposedly leading countries do not have the interest of their citizens. And you're 100% correct, but this is a very big problem. What's your second question?
The second one is, talking about the Torah, how the Torah is perfect, but they're, it's said that the oral and the written are inseparable, and there's been instances where the oral Torah has been sieged by the goyim and edited and had things taken out of it, or altered or whatever. How do we know for fact that our Torah has not been sieged by a foreign government or a ruler at one point in time and edited or censored?
Well, that's always a question that people have, and that's why I mentioned the importance of the beauty of the Torah itself, because that's why I was saying before how this is the most perfect book. But people who are detractors of the Torah will say that it isn't exactly the same Torah. How is it possible after so many years that we actually have the same text? But we do know, when you think about when the Greeks, during the time of Ptolemy, who translated Torah into Greek, that all 72 of the wise men translated it the same way. We also know that every Torah scroll that's found all over the world are exactly verbatim, and that there always were people that maintained the Torah, so that there always are people in every generation who are easily able to detect what is authentic and what's crossed the line there too, in terms of Torah guidelines of what borders on heresy and what borders on things that are distortions of the Torah. And that's also something which we have to always be cognizant of. There's a Rabbi Yaakov Emden said that a greater miracle, it's about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, a greater miracle than the splitting of the Red Sea is the fact that the Torah remained under the harshest, worst conditions of our exile, and there always were Jews that carried the traditions of our people, so that there always were those that knew what was authentic and what wasn't. And there are to this day, and in our generation, Torah has flourished. There are more yeshivot today in the world, probably since the Second Temple, maybe even before, and people are studying it. So it has been revived, and the Torah has survived. So we know what really is authentic down to each word, each letter of each word. All right. Thank you very much. And if there's anything else anyone would like to ask before we sign off. And
yes, Rav. I'm also on Achiud's camera. It's Daniel.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about your earlier statement with regards to hatred of racism becoming almost like a religion.
Yes.
Can the reverse be said, rather, can the same thing be said about love of racism? Where can somebody think so much or be so obsessed with racism that they make a religion out of it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm saying these are substitutes to religion. These are exactly what I'm trying to say, is that people decided that they would substitute things for religion. Looking at Aaron's note here, Argentina, Denmark, England, Greece, Iceland, and Norway, just a few of the countries that officially identify themselves as Christian countries. I need to look at that Pew report to see what their numbers are. I didn't write, England was 40-something%, I believe,
So
their beliefs.
the point that I was making there is that our identifying ourselves as a Jewish state and a democracy are not in conflict whatsoever. No one would say that any of those countries aren't democracies. So the people who are making that point are either mistaken or anti-Jews.
But when we say that Jews are free in their own land to practice their religion, so couldn't they vote that they can't practice their religion in the name of democracy? Majority rules.
That would cause me to act anti-democratically in response.
Well, that's anti-democratic, but
No. If they told me, if the majority voted that we can't practice our Yahadut, then I would mimic the actions of the Maccabees and act anti-democratically.
okay. So democracy is tolerated to a point. That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. All right, gentlemen. Thank you for listening, and Chanukah Sameach. And I'm signing off.
See you Sunday.
All right. Bye-bye.